everyone. This is Eric from Relevate Presents Scholarship. With the whole world changing in a lot of ways due to COVID-19, we at Relevate have been trying to find a way to kind of like do our part in the process. None of us are epidemiologists, none of us are economists, none of us are like political scientists necessarily, but we do have a unique expertise in talking about relationships. And while people are obviously getting sick, people are going through a lot of financial things, and people are having issues with emotional and mental health, hopefully we can provide some help in that small kind of like sliver of all that people are going through in terms of like managing relationships with all that's changing right now. So in order to do that, we have an entire panel of wonderful relationship researchers. And everyone on this panel is going to provide a unique kind of perspective on different things that people might be experiencing relationship-wise during COVID. So this, I guess, panel discussion is going to be posted on our Relevate Presents Scholarship podcast stream. So if you're listening to this on audio, that's through Twitter, Stitch, or Stitcher, or iTunes, whatever. It'll also be available on video on YouTube. So if you're listening to this in the podcast, you're like, I want to see what these relationship researchers look like. You have that opportunity. What do their houses look like? You can see that too, except for those of us who are in office. And then because we're doing it on Zoom, our audio is going to sound a little different than the podcast normally does. It's going to be a little bit more raw. And we might have some connection issues, but we'll see. But I think most of you are used to that if you're doing podcasts or even watching TV. I was watching the NFL draft and they had a little bit of issues occasionally. So like even very professional organizations had some issues. So hopefully we're not alone in that. But without further ado, let's introduce the panel. So to start, we have Dr. Chelsea Torgerson, who is an instructor in the Marriage and Family Therapy program at the Oregon Institute of Technology. Chelsea, how are you doing with all the COVID stuff so far?
So that's a day-by-day question, sometimes an hour-by-hour question. I think today I'm feeling okay. Yesterday I was feeling really overwhelmed and sad. So I think it really depends on the point in the week. It really depends on the day. But I also can look back over the last 2 months, because I think this is week 8 for me in Oregon of social distance. Our stay-at-home order came pretty quickly after social distancing. And I can think of just how my emotions have kind of ebbed and flowed over the last several months of this, and it changes on any given day. But today I'm feeling okay. And good. I'm really excited to be here.
We caught you at a good time then. Yeah, I can certainly relate to that, especially in terms of, mostly in terms of like work, because like sometimes working from home, I'm like, I'm all about it. I can handle this. And sometimes I'm just like laying out like there's nothing, I can't do anything today. It's just not happening.
Absolutely. And I think everybody else on the panel is on a semester system. My university is on a term system. And so I'm finishing up week 5 of the term. We have 5 weeks left of the term. And so we go until mid-June. And so while the rest of you are knee deep in finals and finishing up, we're still in midterm. So that makes me.
Best of luck to you on that. Also joining us is Dr. Scott Sibley, Assistant Professor of Family and Child Studies at Northern Illinois University. Scott, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it's really, really wonderful to be here. I'm grateful for this opportunity, and thank you very much for having me. Yeah, I think for me, getting through this COVID-19 thing has been an interesting, my wife and I, we have 4 children, and so continuing to be a professor during this period of time has been an interesting thing. I really just kind of secluded myself in the basement from basically 9 to 5 every day. I mean, I go out for lunch. But I think one of the things for me that's been a struggle is just maintaining a routine. I mean, I try to get dressed professionally as much as I can during the week, just because I have so many meetings. But just the eating, sleeping, and exercise, I mean, just trying to maintain even a schedule at that, I think is a struggle for all of us during this period of time. But thank you so much for having me here today.
Yeah, the routine is the hardest part, and you're very welcome. We're glad to have you. Also joining us, Caroline, we just talked about the Caroline Camark, PhD student in couple and family therapy program at Kansas State University. Caroline, how are you?
Hi, thanks for having me, Eric. I'm doing all right. I live by myself, and so I feel like that's been an adjustment of just like I'm going from seeing lots of people on a regular basis to seeing basically no one, to seeing maybe the people that are passing by out the window. And so I think that that's been like the hardest part for me, is making sure that I'm getting out and seeking those opportunities to interact with people instead of just having them come to me like they normally would. So
Right.
it's been a struggle for a while to just trying to figure out what that even looks like. And I'll talk about that kind of professionally in a little bit as well, but it's going.
Yeah, it's a very weird scenario to be in, just in general. And then the idea of kind of like going from seeing people all the time to seeing people like none of the time. And it's just like that stark contrast is very interesting. And last but definitely not least, the person whose idea it was to have a special podcast, Dr. Cayle Bunk, assistant professor in the Human Development and Family Science Department at University of Missouri. Cayle, how are you?
I'm doing well, Eric. Thanks for having us and convening this great panel. I would agree with Chelsea. I'm just taking it a day at a time right now. As a researcher of relationships, uncertainty comes up a lot in my work, and I'm realizing it's one of those things where I need to practice what I preach, right? So I'm one of those people who's like, do as I say, not as I do, because I talk to people about, as a former therapist and as a relationship researcher, that there are times we need to tolerate ambiguity or learn to cope with it. But it's really hard. And so that's what I'm struggling with the most, is the uncertainty, because we're really in this transition period, which I imagine is going to come up a lot in our discussion today, that during transition periods, things can be really stressful and they can create turbulence in our relationships. And so it's something to be mindful of. I imagine we're going to be talking about lots of strategies to help plan and create some semblance of certainty in our lives. But I just wanted to start off by saying, we might make it sound easy, but I recognize personally it's really hard, because that's something I struggle with. And I'm fortunate to have a job, right? Because there's a lot of people who are unemployed right now. And so I couldn't imagine that added stressor on top of what we're having to deal with as a group.
Certainly, yeah. And I think about that a lot, even just in preparing for this, and the things that I'm going to say as like, man, it's hypocritical for me to say this. And I know I'm going to have to say it because it's important, but like, I ain't living it right now. But sometimes that happens.
Yeah, and sometimes it's helpful to recognize that, or I would say that it's helpful to know that you're privileged in some areas, but I have reservations about comparative grief, right? Like this
Right.
person has it worse than me because they don't have a job. I want everyone who's listening to recognize that a stress that you're experiencing is valid. And just because somebody might be worse off doesn't necessarily mean that you can't take that time and have some compassion for yourself. And I imagine Chelsea's going to be talking a lot about that when she speaks, but I think that's really important. And one thing that I've been really grateful for, in addition to having a job, is my health, because there's a lot of people who are experiencing health concerns, not just related to COVID, but there's a lot of implications with the hospitals, some hospitals in some areas being full, right? And so my wife is actually pregnant with our first child. And so that's something that's supposed to be happy and exciting, but it's creating a lot of uncertainty. Like, we don't know when our parents are going to be able to visit our child. We don't know who's going to be in the room. If people are following the news, there previously was some restrictions in hospitals in New York where even support persons couldn't be in the room. And so we were concerned for a while if I would even be able to be in the room when my wife delivers. And so people are experiencing a lot of uncertainty right now. And so I'm really excited that we've convened this podcast to talk to some mental health experts about some concerns that people may be facing.
Certainly. And that was really well put. And I think that's a really important thing in terms of like not using that comparative grief, right? Not saying my grief or my issues aren't as bad as other people's issues, so I shouldn't have any. If it makes you feel better to say other people might have it worse, more power to you. But if you're using that as a means of like saying you shouldn't feel a certain way, that can be really harmful for sure. So let's go ahead and get started. And I think that one of the best places to get started is in terms of just how this situation affects us all kind of in a mental health way, in terms of like anxiety or anxiety within a family or a couple system or whatever the case might be. So Dr. Torgerson, you had a wonderful appearance on local TV talking about this. So now that you're locally famous, let's go ahead and take the next step and make you nationally famous. And why don't you give us a quick little discussion on like, what are some things that families can do or people can do in terms of managing anxiety or just managing this kind of like new stressor in their lives?
Yeah, so I, even though I'm an instructor at a university, I maintain a small caseload at a local agency here in town. And so one of the things that I've been having, and like every week, I'm having conversations with more than one client about what they're feeling regarding COVID-19. Like, I think COVID-19 has come up in my therapy notes every session for the last 8 weeks. And so it's a big deal. And our responses are all over the place. And so it's not just anxiety. Some of us might be feeling anxiety. Some of us might have felt more anxiety kind of as the world was shutting down and as those stay-at-home orders were coming into effect, and social distancing, which we now call physical distancing, and kind of what is this and what does this look like, and can I go to the grocery store, and what about the food places in town? I want those to stay open, but is it safe for me to do so? Just like all of those constant thoughts coming through our head of how do I maneuver this? What's going on? And with the 24-hour news cycle, there's just information overload all over the place, in our email inboxes, in our news that we were watching on social media channels, like news everywhere with very different views on what we should be doing. So I recognize in my own clients and in myself and in my friends that I've had conversations with that there was a lot of like intense anxiety and uncertainty kind of at the beginning of this. And that doesn't mean that people aren't still experiencing anxiety now. What I'm saying is that our feelings have kind of ebbed and flowed. And so some folks might be feeling a little bit more grief right now. Like, so for myself, I'm supposed to be in Minneapolis, St. Paul right now, going to a Reba McEntire concert with my parents to celebrate Mother's Day with my mom, and clearly I'm not there. And so there's some sadness that I feel about not being able to do that and grieving all of the plans that I had for the last 2 months. None of them came to fruition. And so like kind of what Cayle and Eric were talking about, just even if we are healthy, I'm not sick, I'm healthy, I have a job, it's okay that I'm sad that I don't get to go and celebrate Mother's Day with my mom who lives in a different state. It's okay that I'm bummed that these events and these activities that I planned this spring aren't happening. And so kind of that normalizing piece, the recognizing that that comparative suffering is just not a good thing to get into. And it's really easy for us to do so, especially with the social media outlets that we have, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all of those things. So while some of the things I'm going to talk about in a few minutes kind of do help ease anxiety, I also want to recognize that anxiety might not be the thing that you're feeling. It might be sadness, it might be anger and frustration so in my state, we don't know when the state's reopening. Our stay-at-home order is in effect until the governor lifts it, and we don't have a date on that yet. And so there's a lot of uncertainty around when that's going to happen. And so there's a lot of feelings around that. And so kind of how I've started talking about self-care and coping is through the lens of connection. Even though we're being asked to stay apart, there's still ways to connect. And the 4 categories that I have kind of started talking about this through is connection to self, connection to others, connection to nature, and connection to a higher power. And I also want to say that some of you might find other categories that this could fit into, but for the purpose of this, we'll just talk about those 4. And what I mean by connection to self, I mean all of those activities that make you feel human. connection to your body, connection to your senses, eating healthy. I had to put myself in a quarantine snack timeout because I was depression baking. Like I was sad, I was baking brownies and baking cookies out of sadness, and that had to stop.
I've made cinnamon rolls twice over the course of these weeks.
Oh my God.
And a couple of cakes also, so I've been also doing the same thing.
Yes, cookies and brownies were like kind of a part of my food pyramid, if that's even still a thing. And so I had to stop that. And then I went back to my healthy eating as clean as I could, and as healthy as I could, finding foods that fuel my body. Exercising, moving your body is really important. So whether that's running or walking or yoga, doing at-home fitness classes. I know that gyms are closed right now, or many gyms are closed, but there are a lot of at-home routines that you can be doing. Just get your body moving as much as you can. Drink water, all of the water that you can, which is really hard for me to do as well. I'd rather drink coffee, or I'd rather drink, kombucha, but I need to drink water. Engaging in mindfulness practices, becoming aware of what you're feeling and the sensations in your body. We talked about routines, and they are hard. One thing that might be helpful is like, what's one thing that you can do in your morning that can get you started for the day? Maybe it's making your bed, or maybe it's making yourself breakfast or your family breakfast. Finding that one activity that can get your day started and you can keep going then, kind of that momentum piece. Another thing that has been helpful for some of my clients and some of my friends is journaling. We are living in a very interesting and strange time in our global, in our national, in our state, and in our individual histories. 20 years from now, we'll have made meaning of this. This will all make sense, and we'll have probably packaged it with a nice little bow of what this was like and how we survived. But also remembering what you did day in and day out to get through this will be like your families from generations from now will be able to look back and say, wow, 2020 was interesting. How did you do it? And you'll have very specific daily or weekly excerpts of like what you did. So I think that would be a really cool historical thing for you and your family to engage in. Not only does journaling help process emotions and process thoughts and what's going on in your life, but it also can help just keep track of what did we do for these however many months in 2020. So again, connection to self is finding all those activities that make you feel human. You cannot give to others. You cannot do for others without first doing and giving to yourself. And so in order to have connection to others, which is the next category I'm going to talk about, you have to have connection to yourself. You have to be able to be in touch with you and who you are and what you're doing. Again, not always easy. This probably sounds like I'm making it sound easy. It's not. This is something that I still struggle with, and I study this and I teach this and I provide this information with my clients. Connection to others. So this one is challenging, and I think Caroline and Dr. Monk are going to talk about how to build relationships and how to kind of fight the loneliness that we might be experiencing. But I do want to touch on like different self-care activities that you can do relationally. So I think the thing to remind yourself is that you have to part of what you're doing is staying connected to the family unit inside of your home, whether that's a partner or a family, if you have kids, but also a connection to people outside of your home, which can be really challenging because we're all doing this virtually, right? We're on Zoom right now, we're doing this virtually, and that can be really exhausting. And so sometimes having connection with others requires priorities and boundaries. And so like maybe you have a Zoom game night with friends across the country, but if you're not feeling well, it's okay to say, I can't do this tonight. Can we reschedule? Because you have to think about, is this going to fill me up or is this going to deplete me more? And other things that you can be doing inside of your home are, create game nights or movie nights. Kids aren't really going to care so much about the activities that you did with them. they're going to remember more so that you did something with them. And so getting creative about how you're spending time with your kids and with your partner is really, really important. Connection to nature. So get outside safely. I know that some states have different restrictions on where you can go and what you can be doing outside, but run in your neighborhood, go for a walk in your neighborhood, listen to the stay-at-home orders or the shelter-in-place orders in your state, but figure out ways that you can, maybe you're just sitting on your front porch or your back patio, reading or talking to your partner or your family, but get outside. It's springtime, which means that the weather is getting nicer. Cannot imagine what this would be like had this hit in the dark of winter. Our feelings would have been even more all over the place. But get outside, do what you can to get outside when you can. And then the last thing that I'll touch on here is connection to a higher power. Whatever your religion or spirituality looks like, relying on that belief system is really important in times of uncertainty and times of stress. And so whatever that might look like, maybe it's attending your church service online, or maybe it's, maybe going outside is part of your spiritual practice, or whatever that looks like. Figure out how you can still stay connected to that, even in all of this uncertainty. And then I also want to touch on the fact that none of us have this figured out. We are all doing the best we can with what we have given our circumstances. And so if your coping looks different than somebody else's coping, so be it. If you want to eat the cookie, eat the cookie. I put myself on a quarantine snack timeout, but I'm going to go bake some cookies this weekend, not out of sadness, out of celebration. So, but enjoy those things that make you feel good. Part of the challenge in this is that it's trial and error. Some of the practices we're going to talk about today aren't going to work for you. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try or that you couldn't try, but it just means that you might have to go through a couple of different things before you can find what works for you and what works for your partner and what works for your family. And then last, it's okay to not be okay. I think we've all touched on the challenges that we've had in all of this, but it's okay that there are days that are going to be hard, and it's okay that there are days that are going to be really good. Both are extremely valid and both are going to happen. And so just coming to terms with the fact that today was just really, so yesterday for me, sadness. It's okay that I was sad. I know exactly what I was sad about. I can pinpoint it, and I just let myself sit with it. And now this morning I'm not sad. That doesn't mean that 3 hours from now I won't be. And so I think just letting yourself feel what you need to feel and do what you need to do is really important.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting and helpful point in terms of sometimes strategies might not work, and sometimes a day a strategy does work one day, it might not work the next day. And just kind of being okay with that, and kind of what Cayle mentioned, self-compassion, and that being such an important part of this in terms of being okay, not being okay, and being okay, excuse me, if something isn't working that worked before, or being okay if you're trying to put yourself on quarantine snack timeout and you sneak a cookie or something like that, not falling into kind of feeling all the shame that could come from that. And that's really
the shame spiral. I'm glad you brought this up, because I have one more thing that just came to my mind. That some of the things that you were doing before COVID-19 might not be working. It might not be enough to get you back to a normal level of functioning, because chances are our window of tolerance for stress and trauma is shrinking, which means that we are going to either become extremely overwhelmed, or we're going to shut down a lot quicker than we used to. And so, what used to work might not work right now. And that's okay. It's frustrating, but it's okay. And so finding the things that can. Our lives have been completely flipped upside down. No matter how you've been impacted by COVID-19, we've been impacted by it. And so,
definitely
finding new tools is important.
Does anyone else have anything that they wanted to kind of mention along this lines of kind of like managing anxiety with the family, or managing whatever feelings people might be experiencing within the family, or mental health, self-compassion, stuff like that?
I think something I hadn't mentioned, and those are just such excellent thoughts, Chelsea. I just really appreciate those, just really outstanding, the things that you said, because I think those are, people apply those principles, what a difference it can make for their mental health, for their relationships. One of the things I know about families is anxiety travels fast. And, if I'm feeling really anxious, it doesn't take long for me to spread that anxiousness to my wife. And even without us even directly talking to our children, all of our children can start feeling anxious too. And so anxiety travels fast in families, and especially during this stressful period of time. One of the best coping mechanisms we have, and I know it can be very challenging, but one of the things that you can do for your family that could be just so very helpful is to try to be calm, to try to somehow, because I just like anxiety can be very contagious. Somebody that is able to remain calm, that too can be very contagious. I know that it could be hard work to do that, but being able to remain calm in a very stressful situation can be very helpful to the other family members, just to ground them and to help them get through that difficulty.
And go ahead, Chelsea.
Well, Scott, that's a really good point. And I think that when it comes to families, kind of what I was saying earlier about how your kids aren't going to really care about the activities that you do with them, it kind of goes back to that. Like your kids are going to remember how you handled this. That's what they're going to remember. And so if you make this a fun experience for them, that's what they're going to remember. If you are all up in your feelings about it, which there's a time and place to be all up in your feelings, don't get me wrong. But because our feelings do transmit to one another really quickly through families and through friends, just being mindful of how you're projecting or not projecting those feelings, so that others aren't picking up on your anxiety, especially kids, because that is what they're going to remember. Was mom and dad, or mom and mom, or dad and dad, were they stressed through this entire thing, or did we get to have fun? Did we get to stay up late? Did we get to do these things? So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point in terms of like parents taking that time for self-care. And I think with all of this going on and kind of like being around, parents being around kids more often than they would before, there would be a temptation to kind of fall into going into just kind of like take care of mode. And that kind of like being what drives you all the time, and not putting any resources into that self-care. And that's really important because you're setting an example for your children, right? So like when you show that you can be in a stressful situation, maybe even articulate, this is very stressful, this is how I'm handling it. And not only that, but take time for yourself and self-care. You're also setting an example of how kids can do that for themselves, either now or in the future. And I think that's really important. I think that's something that parents can tell themselves, because sometimes self-care might feel like I'm taking time away from children. But to kind of like tell myself, no, by doing this self-care, and however it might look, and children might be part of your self-care, like playing games with children or whatever the case might be. But by taking care of myself, I'm also giving my kids a template to follow on how to do so during stressful times like this, or in stressful times in my future.
I'm also glad that Dr. Torgerson mentioned that there is a time to feel your feelings, as she put it, because as I think all of us, or the majority of us, are either currently therapists or former therapists, we don't want to give the message that emotions are bad, right? It can be tempting to say, like, just don't be emotional, for lack of a better word, but that's not what we want to do, right? Emotions are really important. I wouldn't want to live in a world without emotion. Like they give life color. And so recognizing that you need to acknowledge those and be mindful of those, and set aside time and space to work through tension, because nothing irritates me more than anxious and someone says calm down, right? And so we don't want to give the message that if your partner is reacting in a way, or you're not reacting in a way, you need to be calm, you need to be calm. That can sometimes disenfranchise their grief, right? And so I think that's important to acknowledge as well, that it's about balance.
Absolutely, and validating people's feelings. And just like in grief, in terms of like losing a person, sometimes people deal with it very differently, and those feelings are okay, and the ways of dealing with it are okay. So just kind of validating that for people in your family is really important. And if they're angry, if they're sad, if they're feeling whatever, just kind of validating that and letting them know that it's normal to have feelings that you maybe don't understand at times like these. And I do think that this could be, oh, sorry, go, Chelsea, do you have a point?
I have one more thing, and then I'll be quiet because I know that I've talked a lot. One of the things that I think is really important to recognize is that like we all want to go back to normal. We want things to be normal, and I think something that we need to recognize is that we don't go back from this. Like, we move forward with this, and so even once our states reopen, even once the healthcare system has recovered, even once like all of this is said and done, like there will be new normals that we need to create in our individual lives, in our professional lives, in our families, and so yeah, like there is a grieving process with that, right? Like, things are not the same as they were in February, and they won't ever be that way again. And that's kind of a broader, we're probably not there yet in processing that, but that is another grief cycle that might come through in the coming weeks, months, years, as we kind of move forward with this, which might be anxiety, and it also might just look like grief and loss and sadness and anger. So something to consider.
Absolutely. And I think that that's an important point. And while that thought can be scary, right? Like, things will never be the same again. That's also true of other things in your life. Like, you know, you can't ever go back to the way things were, no matter what happens in your life. And I think that's an important thing, just to kind of like, yes, that's true. And that's really important for us to recognize, but also you've done that before in your life. Like, you've handled things and you can handle them again. I did want to get into parenting kind of stuff, because I know that we talked about how anxiety can travel in a system, and how it can be difficult for parents to kind of like manage this and kind of manage having children, especially just having more time around children because they might not be in school. And, you know, kids, depending on their age and abilities, might not fully understand what's going on, or they might like only partially understand. I read an article that was written by Zach Lowe, who's a basketball writer, about basketball players parenting during this time. And one of the basketball players is talking about how his kid is attributing everything to COVID. Like, oh, you know, we wash our hands because of COVID. And it's like, no, we do that like forever now. That's a thing we do. And it's just funny to think about, like, you know, how does this kind of like look through a child's eyes? So it becomes kind of like important for parents to think of ways of handling this. And I think that self-care thing that we talked about is really important. So kind of like managing things for yourself so you have the energy to do that, because, you know, when you don't have the energy, like, you can just kind of like burn out, and then things get worse and things get harder, and you don't want to do that to yourself. And again, self-care, this is something that I tell parents in therapy to tell themselves if they're ever feeling a certain way. Just remember, you're setting an example for your kids. You're teaching them stuff by doing this. It's not just about you. You're also doing this for them. And I'm going to go over a couple of just other quick things outside of the self-care that I already mentioned. And again, these might sound kind of difficult, and they are difficult, but just like what I said before in regards to getting through this and things never going back, these are things you've done as a parent before. You're just kind of hitting the reset button a little bit. So in terms of like setting boundaries, you've done that as a parent before with kids and what that looks like, but now you have to hit the reset button because there's different circumstances, right? So just as you might have set boundaries in the past in terms of like rules, or in terms of like what is allowed and what's not allowed, or like what happens during this time, or everyone being at dinner, whatever the case might be, you're just kind of like renegotiating them a little bit to manage the new circumstances. And depending on how old your kids are, they could be a part of that process, right? So like older children might have a say in what the boundaries look like or what structure looks like. And that can give them some more buy-in. Or it might just be that parents are, if they're a little bit younger, parents might just kind of be like, just like making sure they're communicating those. So it might be kind of how Scott was saying, like, from this period of time, I'm in the basement kind of sequestered, and this is what I'm doing, or from this time to this time, I have to be in a meeting, so I want to play whatever game with you, but from this time to this time is work time. From this time to this time will be play time. And that's kind of goes into the next point in terms of establishing a routine. And this is where I feel the most hypocritical and all the things that I'm going to tell people is establishing a routine, because I am terrible at establishing a routine if there's not like stuff around to kind of like build it around. So doing that, even though you could go through this process without really a routine, right? You can get up whenever you want. You can kind of like eat whenever you want, do whatever. When you establish a routine, that creates a structure. And as much as teenagers and other kids might fight structure, they also really crave structure, and they crave boundaries and routine. And that can kind of like really help them negotiate this process instead of feeling uneasy about things, because they're probably already feeling uneasy about things, right? My entire life just got changed out of nowhere and I'm not ready for it. So establishing a new routine, well, it might take some time to establish it and to kind of create it. And it might be a tough week or who knows how long in terms of like until it feels normal. It can establish a new normal feeling, kind of like ease some of that anxiety. Also utilizing technology and resources. So for things like finding good academic programming, either on TV or on the internet, finding ways to kind of like use connection that your kids might be lacking right now. So like, how do I set up Zoom for my kids or set up Skype for my kids to talk to their friends, because they might not see their friends very much. And kids might be their face pressed against a window and be like, oh, I want to go play with my friends. Or it could be my friends are playing outside. Maybe parents aren't, necessarily putting the same restrictions that my parents are. Now I feel a certain way, but still using technology to kind of like allow kids to interact with other kids, maybe see other family members, maybe that they would normally see, or so kind of like using all the tools that you have at your disposal technology wise, and, using technology to find out what those resources are, right? So you might be sitting at home and be like, I don't even know where to start with that. Just kind of like searching online and kind of checking out what's on PBS or what's on this other website that would be good for kids and learning right now, or what would be good for, a quick science experiment I could do with my kids. Do I want to get Alka-Seltzer and Coke and put it in the backyard and make an explosion? Is that what that is, Alka-Seltzer and Coke? I don't remember what it is. I don't remember what it is. Tums and Coke, something like that. Anyway, just kind of like finding different educational opportunities, but also finding ways for kids to kind of interact with each other and using technology. And using technology to find resources is really important. So obviously it seems very simple when I say it, and there's a lot more to it. And establishing a new routine would be really difficult, and it might be especially difficult for kids, for example, who might be on the autism spectrum, right? Who like a new routine would be really difficult for them to kind of establish. But the sooner you can kind of like create that new routine, even though it's going to be really hard to break the old routine, to establish the new routine, it can help stabilize kind of an unstable situation for individuals who might not have the capacity to handle all that's going on because they're children, right? So like they don't have the same emotional and mental structures we have, and they don't have the years of experience to draw on that says, I've gone through this before, I can go through it again. So what other things that you guys can think of that might be important for kind of parents to consider during this time?
Yeah, I think this can be important for individuals as well as parents, but even creating like a physical space where you are doing work, where you are having fun. Because if you're able to tell the children, like if I am in this spot in the house or this spot in the apartment or whatever it is, that means that I'm working. And so that can kind of help be a visual representation of some of those boundaries, some of those time limit boundaries that you may set for yourself and for your children. It can also help individuals kind of isolate and kind of compartmentalize a little bit what they're doing where, so that they're not doing things like trying to take the laptop to bed and work on things in bed, because then it'll cause sleeping to be not as great and all those sorts of things. So if you're able to think about creating those physical boundaries as well as kind of some of those boundaries around time and all of that, it can be beneficial as well.
I love that. And I love that idea of kind of having different spaces in the house. And that could be used at least for kids too, and like communicating if they're not feeling a particular way, if they're feeling really upset, maybe they have a certain space they can go to that's very comforting. And that not only lets them to feel comfort, but also communicates to parents, hey, I'm going through some distress, even if they're not good at articulating it. Because sometimes kids aren't going to come up and be like, I'm feeling so depressed right now. Can we talk about that a little bit? Kids don't have that same language necessarily. So just kind of like having some spaces for them that communicate different things could be really helpful.
Yeah, and with that, I think what Eric's kind of getting at is holding up like an emotional mirror or engaging in some reflective listening where you might be able to notice that their behavior has changed, or maybe they're being more disruptive, uncooperative. And so you can say, I'm feeling really stressed right now, or I'm feeling really worried or scared. I wonder if that's how you might be feeling, or I'm feeling angry. What do you think? What's something that you might be feeling? And having those conversations can help children label what they're experiencing so that they can also acknowledge it and work through it as well. And so I think that that's something that's really critical.
Definitely. I love that. And for some of us, parenting might be a big stressor and kind of being around kids all the time. And some of us who might be in romantic relationships might also be experiencing some new things that they have to kind of manage. So, for example, my wife and I work at the same place, but we don't see each other super often during the workday. And now we're home all the time and having to manage like work time versus non-work time, and just being around each other and just being around each other all the time. So, Dr. Sibley, you kind of had a nice TV appearance as well. I guess 2 now. I haven't seen your second one, but you've had a couple of TV appearances talking about this. So what are some suggestions you would give for people who are maybe have a live-in partner or are married, kids or not potentially, in terms of how do you kind of maintain your relationship and manage conflict and handle all that, being around each other all the time might entail?
We'd like to pretend that somehow we could just all just sit on the couch together and hold hands for 24/7, and everybody's just gonna be happy, and we don't have to go about our lives. But that's just not the way life works. We really have lots that all of us need to be still working on. And if we're both working, I think that could especially be true where we both have to dedicate time to our employer, even if it's online. We still have to do that. The thing that can happen, I think, in any relationship, if you're just right on top of each other all the time, you can get on each other's nerves. It's just a matter of fact, I think, in life, is that we all can do that. And if we're not careful, we can really start annoying each other. So I think one of the ways to prevent that is actually, and this is something I've been talking to some of my therapy clients about, is that you've got to make time for alone time too. It just can't be couple time all the time. And that's okay. I think it's actually a very exciting thing to say, well, I've done this activity and you've done this activity, and we're going to come back together and kind of talk about our day and how it went and different things. I think that could be actually a really exciting thing for a couple to do. As far as intimacy goes, I think it's just critical that couples still make time for intimacy. In that television interview that I did recently, one of the viewers actually had asked a question, and that was kind of exciting for me to answer a question that they had right there as we're going through that television broadcast. And it was really about, how do I keep that spark alive during this COVID-19, because we're just really stressed. And I think one of the ways that you do that is that you schedule out time to be together, to have a date night together. And so it could be that, you make a meal for your children, and then you order takeout from one of your favorite restaurants and then bring it back to the house, and you have just a little date night together yourselves. It could be that you schedule a time out for physical intimacy, or watching a movie together, whatever it might be. I think, and these things can still apply even after COVID-19 is over. These are good principles actually just to learn as a couple regardless. But I think especially during this time, you could just say, well, my couple relationship just needs to take a back seat now because I have all these other stresses I have to worry about. But you're not going to be the best employee you can be. You're not going to be the best parent you can be if your couple relationship is just suffering. You're going to be even more stressed out than you were before. And I think another thing I think about too is, I think some people are worried that the divorce rate's going to go just skyrocketing after this, because we're going to have all these angry couples, stressed out couples with each other. And it doesn't have to be that way. I think this is a time for couples to be more united, to come together, to be intentional together. And in fact, I think it actually presents a very unique opportunity. I'm more of an optimistic type guy. And so this really presents an opportunity to actually strengthen the relationship, to make it even better than it was before. This time that we have to slow down could actually help you reprioritize your life. And it'll be interesting to actually see how that works, because I wouldn't be surprised if there are some families that actually, and we're not going to do it ourselves, but in our family, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's some parents that say, I actually kind of like doing homeschooling. I want to do homeschooling now. Or some couples that say, I was working way too much, or I like working from home now, or I like having different priorities in my life. I wouldn't be surprised that there are some families that choose to do things differently because of this. And so I think it's really, going back to what Chelsea is saying and what others were saying, we can make meaning from these difficult circumstances, and we can not just make them individually, we can make them as a couple. What it means to be married, why we married each other in the first place, why we decided to move in together in the first place, why we're romantic partners in the first place. And I think it could be a beautiful thing, but again, it's going to require effort. And so instead of pointing fingers at your partner and saying, oh, you're doing all these things wrong, I think the finger actually needs to go this way. And think to yourself, well, what can I do to be a better romantic partner today? What can I do to be a better parent for my children today? I think the responsibility lies actually on each of us. It's not, if we'd stop worrying about finger pointing and just start worrying about our own personal responsibility, we'd be much better off.
Yeah, I think that's a lot to think about for couples. And I also wanted to kind of like pose back a question in terms of like just kind of like the added stress of COVID and stuff like this. And this can be answered by anyone, not just you, Scott. So it may be open to everyone. Managing that extra stress that wasn't there before, kind of like now our relationships changed and because all the circumstances have changed. Like, what are some tips you would give in terms of like just managing that there's this new stress in our life that we've never had before?
So one thing that I mentioned that I study is times of transition for relationships. And so obviously this is a really big transition, and during times of transition and change and stress. And before I go into this, I do want to acknowledge, and I'm glad you brought it up, Scott, that we've kind of hinted at this multiple times, but this stressor or this period of change isn't the same for everyone. Like we're noticing that it's sometimes exacerbating disparities that existed or inequalities, especially among categories of social class and race. There are marginalized groups that are being affected a lot more. And so I appreciate Scott bringing up that there are some people who are actually finding joy during this time and feeling that it's great to spend more time with family, for example. And so acknowledging that, but the majority of people listening to this podcast are probably people who are feeling stressed. So that's kind of why we're focusing more on that side of things. And so I do want to acknowledge that for some people, some of the things that we're saying may not be super relevant. And so that's important to acknowledge. But anyway, during times of stress and change, we can typically be on edge. Even if it's a good change, like getting married, it can still be stressful, right? Anytime that there's a change in our environment or the way that we interact, it requires us to react differently to each other. And so changing patterns can sometimes be really difficult. And so one theory that I use quite a bit in my work is called relational turbulence theory. And the creators, the developers of this theory often compare times of transition to being on an airplane. And it really resonates with me because I'm quite an anxious flyer. And so if you think about it, like when you're on the ground and things are pretty normal, if you hear a noise or hear a rattling, you may not think about it too much. But when you're up in the air, and there's a little bit more uncertainty, there's the threat of loss of life. In our case, there could be concerns about loss of relationship, loss of job, loss of work, right? You're going to be a little bit more hypervigilant, more reactive to that. So when I hear a rattling in the bin, I'm like, is it supposed to be doing that? Is the wing supposed to be bouncing that much? And again, we become more hypervigilant, more reactive. We may be more irritable with our partners. And so according to this theory, there are a few things that emerge during transitions and during this period of heightened arousal, where we might have more biased cognitions. We are more reactive to things that might otherwise be mundane and just normal life. And so two of those mechanisms are relational uncertainty. So you may be experiencing wondering, where are we going to be at when quarantine ends? What's our relationship going to look like a few weeks from now? Is my partner as invested as I am? Especially when we learn new things about each other, right, during quarantine. I saw something comical on Twitter where a wife said that since she's been able to observe her husband working from home, she didn't realize that she was married to the let's circle back to that guy. And so we learn things about our partners that maybe we didn't know before. We see different sides of them. And so with that comes the second mechanism in this theory, which is the potential for interference from partners. And so you might be bumping into each other, right? So I do research on military service members and military couples. And obviously we eagerly await for the homecoming of a service member. We're really excited about it. But it can still be stressful because, for example, you might be used to just taking the car whenever you want. When your partner comes back from deployment, you have to negotiate that. And so it requires additional communication. You can't just take things for granted or make assumptions anymore. You may have to renegotiate childcare. And so one thing that's really important during this period is negotiating household tasks and roles and boundaries. Who's going to do what? Who's going to work when and where. And so to get on this podcast, because my wife also works from home, we had to negotiate who gets the good computer because she has meetings too, right? And so that's something that we had to compromise on and negotiate. She has set up shop. She has her laptop in the kitchen. And a few days ago, I was making lunch and being noisy, and she was on a call. And so she was like off screen, was having to motion to me to be quiet. And so there's all these things that can potentially cause turbulence in our relationship. And so I think that that's really important to acknowledge. And Scott also brought up the concern that some people have. Reporters are constantly asking me, do we think that the divorce rate is going to increase after this, right? And we don't know yet. One thing that we do know is that from prior research on natural disasters or crises, or big societal changes such as war, like World War II, we know that there was big changes in relationship transitions. So for example, we saw immediately after World War II, the average age of marriage dropped. And so people were getting married sooner. They were concerned about a variety of things and recognized maybe they couldn't live without a partner who was deployed. Or they just were in a rush to start a family to feel some sense of normalcy after this period of upheaval, which is really important. And we also saw a big baby boom, right? And so that's another thing reporters ask me all the time is, are we going to see a lot of quarantine babies? And I've seen on Twitter, like during World War II, we saw the baby boom generation, boomers, and people are going to call this generation Zoomers because everybody's on Zoom. But we just don't know yet. And so we're just only going off of our assumptions from past transitions that are similar. And so I think it's really important that it doesn't have to be detrimental to your relationship. It could strengthen your relationship because periods of transition can lead to relationship decay, but they can also lead to relationship growth. And so that's something important to keep in mind. And so doing things like establishing household routines, trying to form some routine as some semblance of normalcy, but also negotiating some of those things, even things that you may assume that you don't have to talk about, like making lunch. I didn't assume that I would have to negotiate that with my spouse, right? But I do need to. And so that's important to establish those boundaries, as Caroline also mentioned.
I really like all that you said there, Cayle, especially the part about kind of like just being more like keyed up. And that's just the way I'm thinking about it, and just kind of like with all that's going on. I've had to end a lot of sentences to my wife with, my tone doesn't indicate how I actually feel right now. So I'm like, I say something out loud and it comes out a certain way. And it's like, that's not how it was supposed to come out. And I have to be like, no, that's not what I mean. That's not what I mean, just because of how it comes up.
That's a really great point, Eric, because I'm sure people are familiar with the classic Good Samaritan study where they had people they told them they were going to have to give a speech and they had to run across campus. And then there was somebody who was in on the experiment where they pretended to fall down or something. I can't remember all the details, but people who were stressed were less likely to stop and help that person. And so when we're stressed or we experience trauma, sometimes it can be really tricky to shut off the anxiety part of our brain, the amygdala that's firing. Sometimes it can override our frontal lobe. And so these cute things that we're talking about in this podcast, like, oh, do more of this, tell your partner that you love them, kiss for 6 seconds every day. When you're stressed, those things go out the window because we react on instinct. We go into flight or flight mode. And so it's important to acknowledge that and to recognize that's normal. But we don't want to think of our partner as a threat. And so I appreciate what you said, Eric, announcing our filters, saying, I apologize because I had this tone with you. I'm really stressed about work. I'm really concerned about our financial security, right? So bringing up those things to kind of cut down on any interpersonal gap, announcing your intention behind what you're saying so that we don't get into mind reading. All those things can be really critical, especially during this period.
Definitely. And Scott, I know you have a meeting to get to. Is there any parting thoughts you have in terms of relationships or kind of like living with spouse or with a partner?
I think that just the biggest thing I'd say is that it goes back to what my friend and colleague Scott Stanley likes to talk about. I think we're presented with a moment here where we can decide how we want to be. We could just let things happen to us. We could choose to be reactive or we could choose to be proactive. And I think we should decide to be proactive during this period of time, that we should plan together as a couple, as a family, as an individual, how we're going to successfully navigate this. And I think we'll be so much more healthy, not just in terms of our physical body or our mental health, but also our relationship health, if we'll really make some really concrete, intentional decisions. Thank you so much for having me. It was just wonderful to be here.
Thanks for joining us, Scott. You can jump off anytime. Thank you so much for being here. So let's talk about, we talked a lot about relationships here. And then there's this other side of the coin too, of kind of like, hey, I'm living alone or I'm not seeing a whole lot of people and I'm trying to manage that stress. So Caroline, just kind of opening it to you, what are kinds of things for people who are feeling lonely? How do you know if you're feeling lonely? How do you kind of manage that? What do you do in those situations? So go ahead and what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so kind of like what Chelsea was talking about earlier, it's just our emotions can manifest in different ways that we wouldn't expect. And so what that can look like for loneliness, it can look like a lot of different things. It can be just being extra irritable and not really understanding why, or depressed or anxious or really like feeling disconnected from the world. So some of these symptoms can be very minute and have a hard time pinpointing it and bringing it back to loneliness, but others can be very obvious of just like, wow, usually I'm hanging out with friends on a Friday night or at least going to get dinner with someone. And now I don't have those options. And so it can be very difficult to make sure that we are intentionally reaching out and making those connections with other people. Because even if we think about it, like working in person, we're at least able to pass by our coworkers and have a conversation with them. And at the moment, like we don't have those same sorts of things. And so if we think about it, like pets are great. Pets are lovely. They help keep us company, but they're not going to provide us with that same social support that we would normally be getting from these people, from our coworkers, from our friends, or even from our family. So I know for me personally, my family is not, I'm in Kansas, my family is not. Same with my partner. So my romantic partner, we're doing a long distance relationship as well. And I know that for myself and probably for others too, it's this feeling of loss of just like, I don't know when the next time I'm going to see them in person is going to be. And so like Chelsea was talking about as well, is just making sure that you're taking that time and stepping back and being able to be sad about that. It is sad that I'm not able to go see my nephew. It is sad that I'm not able to go spend time with my partner, or even, hug him or talk to him, or we can talk, but hug him and have kind of those physical connections that we've had in the past as well. And so it's taking those feelings of loneliness and loss and making sure that we are being intentional about how we're communicating with other people. we are very social creatures. We need that. It doesn't matter if we live alone, doesn't matter if we're introverted or extroverted, we still need to be in contact with someone. And so I know a lot of the times it's easy to downplay our own emotions of just like, people have it so much worse than me. I know that was talked about earlier as well. And so it can be very difficult when you're having these emotions to really reach out to someone and say, I'm struggling today. I'm really struggling today. I'm having a hard time. I'm just feeling depressed or unmotivated or whatever it might be. So that first step of just like making sure we're reaching out when we are having those emotions, so kind of fighting those feelings to pull back and, you know, put on this happy face and pretend we're all well and good. And then the other side of it too, we've talked a lot about building a routine today, and that can be building a social routine as well. So for instance, I used to before pandemic started, I joined a running group. And so I've got a good circle of running group buddies that we all used to run on Tuesdays, and we'd go out to dinner afterwards. And so to kind of help us keep that and help us keep some normalcy, we're still sort of running on Tuesdays and then gathering for, you know, Zoom meet and greet, kind of like we're doing here, to make sure that we're, you know, eating dinner together. And so it can be hard to keep maybe the same exact routines that we were keeping, especially if you're someone that likes to go to a bunch of concerts, go to areas where there are large groups of people, but really making sure that you're taking the time to connect with others. We've got a lot of different apps that you have all probably heard some about, maybe not. Zoom, of course, has been a great one, and Skype, but then there's others such as Marco Polo, where you're able to record just like a small snapshot video of yourself and send it to friends, so that you're at least like hearing them, you're seeing them talk, you're able to see facial expressions and all of that. That can be a little bit better than just talking on the phone or even texting. The other good one is House Party that's come out recently, which gives you the ability to actually play games with your friends. And so for those people that are living alone, it is more important to really reach out and be intentional about it and build in those social routines so that you are making sure that you're getting connection in some way each and every day.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And it's actually, to kind of go back to what Scott was talking about, is like making positive out of this. Like, I mentioned just I'm really into football, so I was watching the NFL draft with friends of mine, and we never would have done this before, but we were just like, let's Zoom together and watch it together. And like we never would have done that had there been no pandemic, because we were all, you know, doing our own thing, or like but you know, I don't see these friends very often. They live far away. But just the idea of like, hey, let's spend time with each other, because we can't spend time with the people like we usually do. And, you know, I'd like to spend time with my friends versus just like, you know, random people on the street. So like, that was a really good thing. And it's kind of made me question, like, how do I live my life after this, right? Like when things start to change, you know, how do I maintain this idea of like, I want to keep up this relationship building and Zooming with friends or whatever the case is, now that I've known that it works so well in this pandemic setting.
And I appreciate you bringing up this topic and saying all that, Caroline, because loneliness is really critical. Like you said, we're social creatures. And so it's important to normalize this desire to reach out and to connect with people. From the minute we're born, we're seeking attachment from our caregivers, right? And loneliness is actually considered a public health risk. And so, for example, people who are lonely sleep more poorly than those who are more socially integrated. It can interfere with our immune system and increase negative things like inflammation and stress hormones. And so that's why people who feel lonely are at an increased risk of dying prematurely across a number of studies. And so that's really, really critical to talk about. But during this time, I think it's also important to distinguish loneliness from isolation in this period where we're self-isolating, right? So loneliness is essentially a discrepancy between the number or the quality of connections that you currently have and the number and quality of connections that you desire or you want. And so people can be surrounded by other people and still feel lonely. And the opposite is also true, that we may be self-isolated and in quarantine, but that does not have to mean we have to be lonely, right? And so that's why a lot of relationship scientists are pushing for us to not call the CDC guidelines social distancing, calling it physical distancing, because the guidelines are we have to stay a certain distance away to prevent the spread or to diminish the spread of the virus. But it does not say we need to cut off all contact, right? And so that's something that is really important.
Absolutely. Any other thoughts on like the loneliness or kind of finding ways to reach out?
One of the things that that comes to my mind in terms of like kind of the isolation, loneliness components here is like when we reach out and we're feeling a certain way, I think it's really important for us to be able to say, I'm feeling X, Y, or Z, but I just need to say that I'm feeling this way. Like I so that we're not putting our emotions on other people. Like when I reach out to people with my emotions, like sometimes it might feel like I'm projecting them, which that's something I need to work on, but also like my intention is not for them to fix whatever I'm feeling, right? Like I'm just trying to acknowledge I feel this way, what have you. So I think there's, if we're trying to reach out and if it's a, you know, isolation piece or a loneliness piece, to really know like maybe what is it that I need in this moment? Do I need to call somebody? Do I need to just text somebody? Do I need to schedule a video session with my family? Do I need to FaceTime my grandma? Like what is it that I'm needing in order to kind of process through these emotions? But also there can be a fear of rejection that comes with that too, right? Like, so if I reach out because I'm feeling a certain way and I get shot down, like I don't get anything in return, or, you know, the person I'm reaching out to goes straight into fixing and I don't want fixing, like there's a possibility of that too. And so, that's something that we need to be cognizant of and also be able to process through as well, is that like I might need to video chat with my friends this weekend, but they might not have the capacity to FaceTime with me or to video chat with me because they might have so many other things going on in their life, and it's not conducive for them to be able to get on a Zoom call. That doesn't mean that I'm not worthy of their relationship. That doesn't mean that I don't deserve connection. It just means that the timing isn't right now. And so finding other ways to be able to feel that and seek out that connection in a different way.
And
I think it's also important to, oops, sorry,
go for it. No, you go. I'm transitioning, you go.
Okay, I was gonna say it's also important to just think about resources in these cases. So like Cayle was saying, you know, trying to decipher who's gonna get the good computer to be able to get on the video conference is important. But with those people that are living alone, they may not have access to those resources. They may not feel, you know, safe and secure going to the grocery store because of health concerns. And so it's trying to figure out in some capacity how to rely on other people to help get those needs met. Whereas, you know, if you're not comfortable going to the grocery store and you choose to do pickup or something like that, you still are relying on someone else to help you get those groceries to your house or help you get maybe medical care. Maybe you get COVID and you're very worried because you are living alone. And if you're hospitalized, who is going to take care of your pet or your house or those sorts of things while you're gone? And so there can be some increased anxiety there with just living alone and, you know, worrying about some of these things and worrying about making sure you're getting those resources, which is why it is very important, like Chelsea was talking about, to really pay attention to what you're needing and then make a plan to try to get your needs met.
Absolutely. So let's transition into kind of our last thing that we wanted to talk about. So people who might not be in a relationship, do they have to give up dating, Cayle?
No, they don't. So that's something that is on people's minds right now, especially a lot of my friends who are single have been reaching out asking for advice on how to be connected. one fortunate thing that we have in this day and age that we live in is that online dating was already very popular. Research shows that even before the pandemic, couple members were more likely to meet online than through more traditional means. And obviously still meeting through friends or bars and restaurants, your college, your church, those are still really common. But online dating is one of the most common way that individuals meet their partner currently. And so there are a lot of great resources out there for online dating. Online dating provides a lot of benefits, such as increased access to larger pools of potential partners, the ability to communicate online before you meet in person, and the ability to find partners based on perceived compatibility. And just put more simply, it's really convenient. You can browse potential suitors in your pajamas, right? And so a lot of people find it very appealing. And since the COVID-19, the coronavirus, has been deemed a pandemic and a national emergency was called, I think, on March 13th. Since around that time, a lot of dating apps have reported a surge in user signups and user activity rather. And so now actually seems like you have more options, at least in terms of using these apps. But having more options isn't necessarily a good thing, because research also shows that we can be overwhelmed with all the options, and it doesn't necessarily help us pick the perfect partner if we can just like keep scrolling or keep swiping through potential partners. And in some cases, it can create that we need to do more relation shopping, so to speak. So you're maybe thinking of the next best thing, like instead of just acknowledging the potential partner who you're already in contact with, you are constantly thinking about and thinking about other options, right? And we definitely do want to be we have standards, right? We want to have standards, and we do want to be somewhat selective, but having a ton of options isn't necessarily as beneficial as we might think that it will be. And so if people are concerned about that, it's good to acknowledge that it's okay. And a lot of apps have been very responsive to the pandemic. And so because we can't meet in person oftentimes, currently, they've offered new services like voice calling in-app, because maybe you don't want to give away your phone number to somebody who you just met. And so you can do that through different apps. So like Bumble and I think Tinder I had my friends send me screenshots before I did a press release. And so my friends who are on these websites were sending me screenshots of the new features that some of these apps have, which I think is really great. But also there are a lot of other great resources that are becoming available. So there's resources like Quarantine Together and Quarantine Bay. I believe Quarantine Bay is just available in Chicago, but there are things like this popping up all the time in different areas. And so it's based off the Netflix show Love is Blind. I don't know if people have watched that yet, but it's this concept of where you kind of put in your interests, and before you see them or you interact with them and form an impression based on physical attractiveness, you're basically assigned someone who they think that this group of what they call matchmakers, essentially, they assign you based on, I think it's all run through like a spreadsheet that you sign up for. And then they connect you with somebody else during this quarantine period who they think that you would bond with. And I think that's really interesting if that's something you're interested in. Again, currently, I believe that's only available in Chicago, but who's to say that if it becomes popular, it won't be available in other places as well. And so I did just want to bring up, I know that we're short on time, some ideas, because a lot of people have reached out to me for what to do for dates, given that a lot of restaurants are closed. I know that in some states, the stay-at-home orders are relaxing. And so there can be obviously this is going to be different depending on what area you're in, right? Some of the things that I'm recommending. But for those who want to continue physical distancing and want to be sure that they're safe and feeling healthy, there are a number of activities that they can do that I've heard about. And so, for example, a lot of like Netflix and there's a lot of museums and zoos are offering a lot of really great resources. So for example, Netflix, you could have a movie night because you can host, I believe it's called Netflix Party or something like that, where you can actually host a movie night and then have a discussion. So you're watching something in real time together. You can take a tour of the Louvre in Paris, right? On YouTube with a potential partner. You can go to the Cincinnati Zoo virtually, and you can talk about what was your favorite animal or what was your favorite piece of art. And so that's something that a lot of the things that you did before quarantine on a date, you can still do now. It just may take some preparation, or it may require you to be more creative and adapt some of these things. And so that's something important to think about. If you're somebody who's really passionate about music, and we know as relationship scientists that self-expansion and learning new things about yourself and your partner is really important. And so maybe music is one of those things. There's a lot of artists who are hosting live concerts in their homes for free, which is really cool. I'm personally a big fan of Lady Gaga, and she put together this whole show of artists performing from their homes as a benefit, which is really great. If you are passionate about a certain game, most in-person games, again, can be performed virtually. It just may take some more creativity. And so one game that I really liked is there's this program called Jackbox where they have a bunch of different games. It's like a party pack. And so we just played that over Zoom, and one of my friends shared their screen, and then you respond on your phone, and it was super fun. There was a game called Quiplash and Fibbage that we had a great time. And so those are potential ideas. A lot of other people are considering taking classes while on a date. So for example, at the University of Missouri, we have an extension service that provides education to the public for free or for a reduced cost. And a lot of land-grant universities in your state might have this. And so look out for classes that you can take, like cooking classes. And in addition to extension, there may be tutorials or YouTube videos of cooking shows or classes where you can get on FaceTime or Zoom and prepare a dish together if you have similar ingredients. You could take an art class, right? And so there's a bunch of different activities that after you engage in that, you can have a discussion about what you made or what you created, and maybe have a competition if who has the best piece of art. It just requires some creativity. One thing that I also really thought was cool was some of my friends encourage their kids to create music videos and send them to their friends. And so there's a lot of apps like TikTok and a lot of other resources where you can record short music videos and send them to your friends. And so that's great. Obviously, with downloading any of these apps, you'll want to be aware of the privacy settings especially if you're recommending them to children. So that's something to be aware of. But because a lot of these apps are being really responsive to the pandemic, even Snapchat now has a games feature where you can play games with people in your contact list. And so you can take workout classes, you can watch dance tutorial videos, and then engage in those together via FaceTime. And one of my friends had this really great idea where her and her partner are quarantined separately, and they're both learning a dance over FaceTime. And then it's giving them something to look forward to, because then when they're back together, they'll be able to dance together. And I thought that was really sweet. And then, of course, the last few things I'll talk about, since we're talking about games, somebody in my neighborhood created a scavenger hunt using QR codes. So you can it's kind of like geocaching. You go to a certain area that you figure out based on a riddle in your neighborhood, and then you find something else. Some people are putting like bears in their windows for kids to find when they go on. I think it's called a bear hunt. And so there are a lot of good ideas that you can find online to engage while also practicing physical distancing. And then people have already been meeting virtually in games like Animal Crossing, Minecraft, World of Warcraft, Second Life. And so these are also being used currently for people to meet up online to talk with their friends while playing games. And so that's something else that you could do on a date. And Caroline already mentioned House Party and some other really great resources. And so the last thing that I want to mention is that we're talking about this. You can hear my dog barking in the background. One of the downsides of working from home, right? It's going to keep going. One thing that I want to mention, and then I'll mute it, is that we're talking about this as if everybody wants to date, but there may be some people who want to wait it out, right? If you're feeling overwhelmed, you're concerned about your financial situation, dating may be the last thing on your mind, and that's okay. One of my friends also said that she's just turned off her Tinder, or maybe even deactivated her Tinder account because she, quote, doesn't feel like having a pen pal right now. And that's totally understandable. And so you want to make sure, though, that you're finding a way to meet your social needs elsewhere. That just may not be a stranger, a potential date, right? You may get your social needs met right now by your friends and family. And so you need to be connected with somebody.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that I tell people a lot, and obviously interacting online is very different than interacting face-to-face, but it's not necessarily like a less than thing. So I think people who might be in a situation where they maybe wouldn't have communicated so much through technology before are now kind of a situation they are. It's not less than, you're not cheapening your communication or cheapening your relationship. You can still have intimate relationships. You can still build intimacy. You can still build friendships, romantic relationships online. That's something I talk to people a lot about, because I feel like there's this running narrative that technology is ruining how we communicate, and it's really just giving us a different avenue to do so. And it might be, communication might look different, but it's not worse or less than. And the other thing, especially in terms of like meeting people, and this goes for like meeting people online who you're interested in dating, or meeting people online through other means, through, you know, whatever the case might be, through groups or through chats or whatever the case is. Building trust obviously is an important part of relationships. And one of the big differences between building trust online versus building trust in person is self-disclosure, or telling things about yourself. Builds trust much stronger online than it does in person, because that's kind of like one of the biggest things you have to go from. You don't have the same like face-to-face interaction or like seeing facial expressions. So that's really important to know, because that's a good way to like learn how to build trust with someone. But it's also a cautionary tale in the sense of like, if a person's telling you a lot of things, that can start to make you feel more trusting, even if those things aren't necessarily true, right? So there's definitely lying that happens on the internet. Hopefully you knew that already.
Deception, yeah.
Yeah. But just kind of like knowing that something that might make you feel really trusting if a person's telling you a lot about themselves, but just kind of like checking yourself with that as well, as like, hey, I know that this is something that is good because I'm building trust, but I also want to make sure I'm checking myself and making sure I'm not going so trusting that it could be potentially a problem in the future.
Yeah, it's all about balance,
Yeah.
like we've been saying, and I'm glad that you brought that up. It can feel like during this period that the accelerator is applied to intimacy, because a lot of the conversations we have are probably going to be focused on the pandemic, and some of the topics that we bring up, even to strangers, might be more heavy than normal. And so again, that's why I say it can feel like the accelerator is applied to intimacy. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Some people feel like they don't want to have superficial conversations right now. They want deep connection. And so it's really important to acknowledge that, and not to set your expectations too high, because that deep connection, again, it might come from friends who you already have this rapport established with. You may not feel comfortable being as vulnerable with a stranger who you just met online. And so I think that's important that you brought that up, Eric, because safety is really critical. And so paying attention to some of the safety features within these apps is really critical too.
Absolutely. And I think one of the big questions that everyone's facing right now is, with all this time at home, what do I watch on TV? So what are we all watching? Chelsea, let's start with you. What are you watching?
So I'm gonna, before I dive into what I'm watching, I'm gonna just say that like what Cayle just talked about is really the like connection to others piece that I was talking about. And he was talking about it through the lens of intimacy, but honestly, a lot of the activities that he mentioned can be done with friends or with your family. And so I think that's one of the cool things about what we've been talking about today is that even though we had sections that we were kind of more in charge of, so to speak, that it all kind of intertwines, and that
Definitely.
you know, finding ways to you know, build intimacy in all of your relationships. So just keep that in mind for those of you who are not interested in starting dating right now, that those are still some things that you can do with people you already know or people that you want to become friends with.
And kind of managing that like superficial stuff, which is still important for social needs, and maybe like that deeper stuff too.
Right. What am I watching? I finished watching Big Little Lies. I have Hulu, and Hulu and HBO must have had some sort of partnership happen because I got to watch that. Before the pandemic, I finished Shameless. I kind of wish I would have waited until now to kind of deep dive into that, but really love that show. It does a pretty good job at giving an idea of what addiction looks like in the family unit. And another thing that I'm revisiting right now during my at-home time is Golden Girls, a classic.
Very nice.
I love that show.
All right, Caroline, how about you? What are you watching?
Yeah, so I like to keep it lighthearted with my shows. So I'm currently watching Schitt's Creek, and I'm excited to move on to Community after that.
Very nice. Cayle, what are you watching?
So my wife and I have been watching Little Fires Everywhere, which is somewhat similar. At least Reese Witherspoon, who was in Big Little Lies, is also in this show. And it has a really interesting social commentary about race and class. And so we've been watching that. We've actually been watching it with one of our friends back in Kansas, who we FaceTime while we're watching the show, and then we talk about it afterwards. And so that's what we've been watching most recently.
Very nice. My wife and I decided to get Disney Plus because of pandemic. So I've been watching The Simpsons, which I haven't watched since for a long time. And I forget that it's how funny it is and how well written it is. And I'm also, and this is something other people I think would be embarrassed about, but I am like obsessed with, there's a show, I think it's on Cartoon Network, but it's on Netflix. And I'm a big superhero person. It's called Superhero Girls, and it's on Netflix, and it's amazing. It's like if you take all the superhero girls from the DC comics and you put them in high school, and then like the people who did My Little Pony, I think, are part of it. And it's just hilarious and adorable. And it's very lighthearted, which is, I have to watch lighthearted things. I'm like you, Caroline, I have to watch things that are lighthearted. So I've watched through all the episodes at least twice. So I've been very much into that. Any parting thoughts before we kind of wrap up?
One thing that I wanted to mention is that, like, if you feel like this is overwhelming, and if you feel like you're having emotions that are all over the place, there are many trained clinicians in every state across the country who are accepting clients. We're not doing in-person therapy right now. Well, I guess that depends on which state you're in. Actually, I don't know that any states are currently allowing in-person mental health care at this point. But there are resources out there. There are clinicians who can help you. So do a Google search and search therapists in my area. You might find a Psychology Today link, and just look for people who might be able to help you, because you don't have to do this alone.
Absolutely. Reach out to friends, reach out to family, reach out to potential resources like therapists or mental health workers, whatever the case might be.
Thanks so much for bringing that up, Chelsea. I think that's really vital. And the locator on Psychology Today is really great because you can put in your zip code and it can find therapists in your area. Obviously, if you live in a more secluded or rural area, during normal circumstances, you would have to travel maybe over 50 miles to find a therapist. But now, given, like Chelsea mentioned, a lot of therapists are providing telemental health services, teletherapy. That's a resource that you can take advantage of if you're feeling like you're struggling. And along with that, my concluding thought would be also something that Chelsea was talking about earlier, was just having compassion with yourself. So this is obviously really hard right now. And so we may have these grand ideas. For example, if our kids are at home, I've had some friends who started out with their schools gave some packets for giving their kids lessons and doing homeschooling. They were going to work full time and also help their kids, essentially being their teachers. And they quickly realized that that wasn't realistic and it wasn't working for them. And they were feeling really distressed and really discouraged, feeling like they were failing as parents. And that's normal. Like it's hard enough having a full-time job, and then a full-time job during this crisis, and then having to be a parent on top of that, and having to be a teacher on top of that, having to be a partner. So there's a lot of responsibilities that people have that are really stressful right now. And so just being compassionate and giving yourself a break is really important.
Well said. And thank you to all for listening. Thank you, Chelsea, Cayle, Caroline, and then Scott, who had to leave, for joining us. It means a lot for you guys to join us. It means a lot for you guys listening. And a big thank you to all the people who are kind of managing this crisis head on, whether it be in the medical field or whether it be people who are delivering groceries or whether it be people who are just kind of out there working while this is going on. So a big thank you to all of you out there. As always, check us out at myrelevate.com or on Twitter at myrelevate. You can also find our YouTube channel, which is where you'll find this stream. Just search MyRelevate in the search bar on YouTube and you'll find our channel. Thank you so much and have a great day.